Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side. Hello and welcome back. Today's episode is going to be the final part in the What Happened to Brandon Embry episodes. So if you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, you're going to be lost listening to this. So definitely go back and give those a listen. Part 2, I left off discussing how Sarah was left to pick up the pieces after Asheboro closed the case, and I briefly touched upon how she suspected Cassandra was directly involved in Brandon's death and that she had a theory as to how she went about that. But before I elaborate on Cassandra's potential MO, I want to give a synopsis of Brandon's symptoms across 2019, just to paint a clearer clinical picture and to also kind of summarize and go back to what he was going through since part 1 came out about a month ago. Looking back at Brandon's medical history, none of it makes sense, and this is beginning with his initial hospitalization in February of 2019. As a reminder from part 2, Brandon and Cassandra's relationship began prior to Valentine's Day that year. Cassandra did state in the initial message that she sent to Brandon's sister-in-law that they had begun dating in May, but she then told Sarah about the bracelet and roses I mentioned in part 2 that she received for Valentine's Day. So Monday, February 18th, was the day that Brandon went to work, even though he initially felt unwell and was ultimately sent to get a drug test, but stopped to get McDonald's on the way. And at this McDonald's, Brandon became ill and a bystander ended up calling 911. In part 1, I read the full Guilford County EMS narrative, but I want to summarize that incident narrative from that day. The narrative states that there was a 32-year-old male leaning against his vehicle. Chief complaint was altered mental status. Initially, they thought that Brandon was standing outside of his vehicle vomiting, which I clarified they were able to determine was not true. In the ER later, he wasn't vomiting, but he spit out his food because it tasted very poorly to him. But he did end up going back into his vehicle, and he was essentially screaming in pain. They stated that he was able to answer questions appropriately, but that he was displaying erratic behavior in answering of questions, and they give an example. He was unable to describe how he arrived at the current location. They also stated that he had an unsteady gait, and lastly, they say that he had a complaint of a headache. They noted that when he arrived to the emergency department, he didn't want to go onto a stretcher. He wanted to ambulatory into the emergency department and insisted that he needed to use the restroom. They then go on to explain that he was unable to open the door to the bathroom and that he seemed to not understand how to operate the same. The person that was writing the narrative stated that their partner assisted him into the bathroom into the emergency department. Now, it's obvious that there is something going on with Brandon at this point, but he is functioning, albeit not well, but he is functioning. Shortly after his arrival, Brandon became unresponsive. Brandon was diagnosed as hypertensive, having severe leukocytosis, which means that the white blood cells are higher than their normal range. He had hyperammonemia, hyperkalemia, and hyperchloremia. All three of these indicate that there are substances in his blood that are too high, starting with ammonia, potassium, and chloride. During this visit, Brandon was admitted to the ICU after his status deteriorated rapidly. And again, he was in essentially a comatose state, which required him to become intubated. So he had acute respiratory failure, and he stayed in this state for days. He also was having kidney failure, which required him to be on hemodialysis. And again, he was in the hospital for 5 days, almost passing away from circulatory failure, renal failure, neurologic failure, and respiratory failure. I want to briefly go over the rest of his hospitalization. So he returned to the hospital in April of 2019. He was transported after having 2 syncope events at work, so fainting or passing out. So the first time this happened to him, he was standing up. And again, if you remember, Brandon's tall. So thankfully, he didn't have any injuries, especially a head injury, but he did pass out and hit the ground. The second time, he was seated. Brandon again told EMS that he had a really bad headache. He again denied any drug and alcohol use. His drug screen came back negative as it did back in February, and in June, he was hospitalized again, this time on the 28th. This time, he was sent home from work because he looked, quote, pale and jittery. Again, Brandon stated that he had a headache. He felt like he was overheating. He had the nausea, stomach pain, vomiting. He stressed that he felt very fatigued and weak. Now let's jump back into the topic of Cassandra. I'm sure all of you are on the edge of your seat after listening to her audio from part 2. But I'm going to be honest, it is purely speculation for myself, Sarah, or anyone else to say that Cassandra is somehow responsible for the sudden onset of medical complications that Brandon developed once she appeared in his life. Sarah knows that all of this evidence that she has accumulated is circumstantial. This is something that we've discussed greatly and at length, but I'm going to tell you, as I told Sarah during our many discussions of the evidence, and when you have an abundance of circumstantial evidence, and when you have an abundance of, air quotations, coincidences, at a certain point, it becomes obvious that something is not right. One thing I can say for certain is that in Cassandra's short time on Earth, which at the time when she was involved with Brandon, she was maybe 31, 32, illness, death, and tragedy followed her wherever the fuck she went, allegedly. Let's start with Brandon's sudden illnesses that began when he started dating Cassandra, ultimately leading to his passing. To add to that, she initially lied about when their relationship began. Did she do this to seem less suspicious because he passed away? Was it an honest mistake? Was it just another one of her many lies with no real reason behind it? I don't know, but I think it's worth highlighting. But also, don't forget that Cassandra alleges that she lost a pregnancy with Brandon as well, even though there's no proof behind that, and the ultrasound that she sent to Sarah was clearly doctored. There was no identifying information on it. So that's 2 losses in 7 months for her. In part 2, I discussed how Cassandra lied about being plagued with having MS to both Brandon and Sarah, even going as far as faking a walk around Sarah for sympathy. But that wasn't true. Cassandra also lied about having a twin sister that died in a car accident, as well as losing her 1-year-old child when they were sleeping. Both of those things did not happen. But maybe the most tragic part of Cassandra's story is something that she told Sarah. And I'm going to read directly from messages exchanged between Cassandra and Sarah. And in these messages, Cassandra is discussing how many people she has lost over a span of 2 years. I'm going to say that again, and you'll understand why I'm stressing this once I read the text. 2 fucking years. This happens to this woman in 2 fucking years. Quote, and again, she's talking about how many people she lost. Quote, 13. And when my friend in Asheboro, she will be 14, but she's dying from health issues. But I lost 13 of my closest friends, all in the last 2.5 years, to 8 drugs. 2 were a fatal car accident. 1 was shot. 1 was murdered. And then my Viking, which I have no idea about. And she's referring to Brandon there. And Sarah says, goodness, you are definitely a survivor. And Cassandra says, well, thank you, but I'm not a sad case. I'm just a survivor, I guess, and try to keep going. I've lost the best things in my life, and they are all waiting for me one day. But until then, I'm on this planet. Now, is it possible that Cassandra has actually lost 13 people in 2 years, 2.5 years, excuse me? Maybe. Given her track record of lying and the fact that most people don't lose that many loved ones over the span of several years, let alone in 2, is it probable? I don't fucking think so. I really don't. It's conversations like this that make me sit back and wonder why. And over the past month or so, I keep asking myself, what is the motive? What is the reasoning behind this? What motivates Cassandra to surround herself in sickness and tragedy? Is her life actually this tragic? Is she lying for attention? Is she creating some of these circumstances herself? The evidence compels me to believe it's a combination of both, which begs the question, how is Cassandra creating these circumstances, and why would somebody ever do that? Let's start with the why. All of the evidence points to money being a major factor for Cassandra. Again, this is purely my speculation, but the evidence is the evidence. Cassandra has a known history of trying to steal money from her significant others. In part 2, I shared this audio clip from Cassandra's ex-boyfriend.
I used to work on an offshore boat, so she'd tell my bank that she was married to me, but she weren't on my account or nothing. I used to go on like 2-day trips out on an offshore boat. And then I'd come off the offshore boat and she'd tell me how she cashed my check for me, had the bank let her cash it. So that went on like, I'd say she probably cashed, I want to say like 5 or 6 checks before I actually called my bank for her to stop doing that. So they wouldn't let her do that. Because like I told them I wasn't married to her or nothing, so I don't know why she was allowed to cash my check.
It is evident that historically Cassandra has been motivated financially in her relationships, but this behavior did not dissipate once she got married. It escalated. Cassandra didn't just stop at fraudulently cashing checks that didn't belong to her. She then began to try to get her estranged husband to take out personal loans for her.
So I was speaking with Cassandra's husband, and one of the things that I was kind of able to understand from the different men in her life is that if she was denied money, that she could become violent. And personal loans were also something that was very common. Her ex-boyfriend said that she had wanted him to take out a personal loan. Her husband said that she was demanding for him to take out a personal loan, and she actually physically struck him in the face when the loan wasn't going through. She became violent over that.
In part 1, I mentioned that during Brandon's work trip to Detroit, he had told Sarah that there was something up with his debit card. What gets weirder about this is that after Brandon had passed, there were multiple replacement debit cards from his account that were sent to him in the mail. In part 1, I mentioned the last text that Sarah received from Brandon, which was on Tuesday the 10th.
One of the texts that I got from Brandon's phone that I don't believe was from him was saying, I can't do this anymore. I can't even get a personal loan. And Brandon didn't need a personal loan.
At exactly 6:30 in the morning, Sarah got 2 texts from Brandon that read, quote, I can't do this again. And then the other text said, quote, I looked around and I can't even get a personal loan. So as you heard from the audio, and as I elaborated on in part 1, there's a myriad of reasons as to why both Sarah and I were certain these texts didn't come from Brandon, especially when you compare the way that Brandon texts in terms of grammar and punctuation. But what stuck out even further was the fact that he didn't need a personal loan. All of his bills were paid. He had just gotten a bonus from his Detroit work trip. He wasn't in any financial trouble whatsoever. Now, this is obviously not enough evidence to definitively say that the weird checking account activity was Cassandra, or even that she was the one that sent that text about the personal loan. But I think this evidence is too compelling to ignore. I want to circle back to when I presented the question of, is all of this tragedy that has happened and continues to happen to Cassandra, is it a lie? Does she create it? Is it a combination of both? I stated that I suspect it could be both, and I presented a small handful of many examples of the lies that Cassandra has told. But what would drive an outside party like myself to suspect that a lot of her tragedy is manufactured by her, and how would one go about doing that? Cassandra did state that she knew that 13 people that were close to her had passed over the very short span of 2.5 years. So do I think that Cassandra is just running around and fucking killing people left and right? Not exactly. The clip I'm about to play is from Cassandra's ex-boyfriend, you know, the one whose checks she fraudulently cashed for an extended period of time.
Had mentioned that she had passed him a cigarette once, and it had tasted like there was powder on the end of it. And she told him it was fine, that she used to dip her cigarettes in bleach and then smoke them.
So I didn't really think a whole lot about it. I went in and grabbed a pack of cigarettes, so when I was smoking one, then she asked me if she could get one off me, and then
she wouldn't smoke out of the pack that she tried to get him to smoke.
So now you have cigarettes that are soaked in bleach, and she's attempting to give them to her ex-boyfriend without his knowledge. But it gets worse than that.
It was an open vitamin water. I drank it.
And he got sick.
I got sick. I wasn't feeling too hot at all. Like sick right to my gut and stuff. Then after that, I told her I was never drinking an open bottle again. And after that, I just went and made sure every bottle I had was closed and made sure I grabbed it, not her.
As I mentioned in part 2, the woman that you hear in that audio is Cassandra's ex-boyfriend's current wife. And the clip you're about to hear is, I think, what gutted me the most when I listened to this audio. It's obviously really fucked up that he had to deal with the person that he once cared about trying to harm him. But to hear the profound impact it has in his current relationship still to this day was really heartbreaking.
It took a long time before he'd let me make his sandwiches for the boat.
I don't know. I was so weird after, like I said, after I smoked a cigarette and drank the vitamin water, I just went and got my own stuff and made sure it was not.
So Cassandra was combining her ex-boyfriend's cigarettes with bleach and did something to his drinks. Was this the first time she did this? Were these two isolated incidences? I'm inclined to believe that this probably wasn't the first time, and I can tell you that this was not the only occasion where she tampered with something that belonged to her significant other. I believe this because outside of the fact that it is very fucking abnormal to fuck with your significant other's shit with toxic substances in an attempt to clearly cause them bodily harm, I'm going to play another audio clip for you.
Talking to her husband a little bit more, it was like, I think he was just looking back and thinking about things over the years once it was brought to his attention. And he said one time he was making a pitcher of sweet tea and she came up behind him and struck him, and it dropped him to the ground. And the tea spilled, went everywhere, and she leaned over him and said, "How dare you spill tea on me?" So just a very menacing, just a disturbing personality that it just seems like she can just flip a switch and become very angry and violent.
I think it's important to establish a very clear trajectory of her abuse towards her significant others and how it escalates over the years. What I also think is compelling is when you consider the medical history across the board. So you start with the ex-boyfriend who found out that she was poisoning his vitamin water, cigarettes. He had a history of stomach aches, headaches, and a slew of other weird symptoms. Now, let's compare these symptoms to Cassandra's ex-husband's symptoms.
As I'm talking to her husband and talking about different symptoms that Brandon had, he started revealing different symptoms that he had. And he told me that he was driving home from work, and it wasn't that he fell asleep. He had been working at this job and used to the schedule for over 20 years. So it wasn't a lack of sleep or anything like that, but he said all of a sudden he's just blacking out and he ends up on the other side of the road, just falling unconscious. And that was exactly what happened to Brandon a couple of times, two different times, like 2 months apart. But the initial time that Brandon went in the ICU, he was basically falling unconscious, and then another time when he went to the ER. So they had that in common. One of the times that her husband went to seek medical attention, they put him down as being dehydrated. And they told him that his, I want to say it was his liver function, there was something wrong with that, and his kidneys. So again, this is similar to things that Brandon had. Brandon actually had one of his medical records say that he was dehydrated.
But the parallels don't end there. The similarities between Brandon and Cassandra's ex-husband's declining health go even further.
I also was able to look at text messages, and I don't think her husband even realized the extent of his health issues, because I'm looking through there and he's saying things like his kidneys are hurting, he thinks he's got a kidney infection, different things like that. And this goes on throughout the years. I don't think he realized the decline in his health while he was married to her. And he did tell me that he would just have these bouts where he would just get very, very sick. And he noticed when she left to go to Maine, and it was like the time that she had come back for a visit, and he got very sick again while she was there visiting. And she left, went back to Maine, and hadn't been back. And he noticed that he hadn't been sick anymore since she had left.
Over time, Sarah became more and more worried and concerned for Cassandra's estranged husband, especially based on the fact that he was talking to her and giving her information. And Sarah's concerns were for a very good reason. I'm going to play two audio clips. One is going to be Sarah's recount of what happened, and the second is going to be some audio of Cassandra's ex-husband. And I want to give a trigger warning because this is going to be an account of when he was kidnapped.
It was February. I get a text message that I thought was kind of strange from her husband. And it was kind of along the lines of something like, I'm sorry, I failed people, similar to what happened when I got text messages from Brandon's phone. This, not like a suicide threat, but this kind of insinuation of despair. And I thought, gosh, this message is really weird. And then I couldn't get a hold of him. And I had a friend who was also a mutual friend with her husband, and we were trying to get a hold of him, and it just seemed very strange for him to text and not get any answer back. And I just kind of felt like her husband should definitely be concerned for his life, to be honest, after what had happened to my son. And we had a code, and it was, we had an emoji code that if there was danger or he felt like he had been poisoned or sick, that he would send this emoji. So I didn't hear from him. I was trying to get a hold of him, and definitely I was concerned. The next morning, I end up getting this text. I end up getting this emoji that's to represent an emergency situation, and I do end up talking to her husband. The last thing he remembered was being at the gas station that night. He ran out to get gas and cigarettes and then was going to return home to go right back. But instead, he doesn't remember anything and ends up from South Carolina to the beach in North Carolina the next day. He's got a terrible headache. He doesn't have his shoes on. He had an old phone in his hand, not his new phone, but an old phone was in his hand. And he heard sirens. He has no idea what happened or how he got there. But from the text that came on my phone, someone had kidnapped him from South Carolina. And his Jeep was covered with saltwater, sand. So I think they had been driving the Jeep along the beach. And her husband he's not extremely tall. And he said that the seat was like pushed all the way back. And after he was able to kind of get himself like to a point of functioning, he said that he found his shoes and other clothing items, his belt and things like that, were in the back of the Jeep, Jeep Wrangler. And the only thing that was missing was the letters. There was a big envelope of letters and cards and correspondence that Cassandra had from prisoners that she corresponded with, and that was the only thing missing.
So I've personally seen photos of these cards and letters and can confirm they exist. One of those cards was the one I read in part 2 from Cassandra's fiance, Wade Hoover, the convicted child rapist. It's bizarre to me that all of this documentation miraculously went missing during a time where Cassandra's ex-husband cannot account for anything that happened because he simply blacked out. The audio that I'm going to play is him having a conversation with Sarah when she's desperately trying to figure out what's going on, where he is, and how she can help him.
That's the last thing I remember. I got a damn headache. My eyes hurt. I'm sitting around here in some kind of damn empty parking lot with damn sand dunes around me. I don't know where the hell I'm at.
Did you send those messages from your phone?
Sir, I don't remember anything after the store. I'm trying to stay out the sunlight because my head's hurting really bad until I found some ibuprofen in the Jeep. My damn shoes are missing. My belt's missing off my pants. I found my glasses in the floorboard where I was in the back seat.
Well, tell him you're calling back now that you know he's okay.
Okay. Do you know where you are?
No, I don't know where I'm at. The phone died. I think I took you a picture. I was real sleepy. I couldn't hold my eyes open. Nothing. I was in a parking lot. Still in the parking lot right now. I'm looking at damn sand dunes, and I heard a siren earlier, and it quit. I'm looking at big-ass sand dunes.
Did you send the photo earlier with the billboard?
Yeah. I remember waking up trying to find the phone, and I had the wrong phone in my hand. I had an old phone in my hand. I didn't have this one. I found this one up under the seat, and it was about dead.
So there's obviously a common denominator across the board here, right?
Once I started digging into the medical stuff, it just didn't make sense. He's constantly sick to his stomach. He's going to urgent care saying he'd been sick, vomiting, nausea for 2 months. And I thought, gosh, that's, just a really, really long time. And then falling unconscious for no reason. And I just, it just starts putting this puzzle together of all these things that don't make sense, but they keep happening. So there had to be some kind of reason. And then to start looking for, what that cause was, because Brandon was relatively healthy. He cared a lot about his health. He was definitely one to go to the doctor if he didn't feel well. And for him to have these severe, mysterious symptoms, there had to be some explanation for that.
So I left part 2 off with a clue as to what Sarah thought happened to Brandon. So, what is cheap and easily accessible? Well, ethylene glycol or antifreeze. Ethylene glycol is a solvent that is typically used in antifreeze, but it can also be found in other de-icing solutions. It is incredibly toxic and typically lethal when it is ingested, whether that be intentional or accidental. While this number can vary based on factors that include weight, lethal dosing of ethylene glycol is around 100 milliliters per person. And I'm going to throw a bunch of citations into the show notes. There's going to be at least 4 or 5 journal articles to back this information up. When ingested, ethylene glycol doesn't really bind to proteins in the body, and this is very problematic because this facilitates a very rapid absorption within the GI tract. Ingestion leads to severe acidosis. As the body tries to metabolize this, it causes a breakdown of the organs and it ultimately results in death. The metabolites of ethylene glycol cause the formation of calcium oxalate crystals. And if that sounds familiar to you from part 1, then kudos to you, because in part 1, I detail how Brandon's urine tested positive for calcium oxalate crystals during his first ER visit. But I do want to be abundantly clear. While it is compelling that these crystals were found in his urine, ethylene glycol poisoning is not the only cause. Diets rich in oxalates or calcium can also cause this. I found a study in a journal article that I will link in the show notes that detail the symptoms of a 38-year-old man that was exposed to ethylene glycol twice through 2 different suicide attempts. I'm going to gloss over the symptoms, but I do want to make some comparisons between Brandon's symptoms and this 38-year-old man's symptoms. when this man presented to the hospital, he was in almost a comatose state, which required him to be intubated. When Brandon initially presented to the ER, he was not in a comatose state. However, sometime between 10 a.m. after he was admitted prior to noon, his health declined, leaving him in a comatose state, which then required him to be intubated as well. This article highlights the man's labs, significant for metabolic acidosis, and then it notes his kidney failure, which required hemodialysis. Brandon had the same exact situation. Now, the lab was not able to test urine for oxalate crystals in this case, but again, Brandon's urine had these crystals. However, they did perform a renal biopsy, which showed these crystals. This was never done on Brandon. Additionally, both men were hypertensive, so high blood pressure, although after Brandon was intubated, he was then hypotensive, so his blood pressure dropped after he was intubated. Lastly, both men had hyperkalemia, high potassium. Now, there are some stark differences in the way that Brandon and the man in the article presented when they arrived at the hospital. For example, a high anion gap, which shows if your blood is either too acidic or not acidic enough, is commonly referenced to potentially indicate ethylene glycol intoxication. And the man in the article had a very high anion gap. Comparing this to Brandon's initial ER visit in February, Brandon's was low. However, Brandon had a high anion gap every visit thereafter. So now that's April, June, and September. Again, none of this is definitive proof of ethylene glycol poisoning. These symptoms could have another cause, but to me, it is bizarre and definitely worth exploring that a young and otherwise healthy man suddenly experienced kidney failure, as well as the myriad of other symptoms that he suffered from between February to September. It is undoubtedly compelling to examine Brandon's symptoms and compare them to cases of ethylene glycol intoxication. So, to me, Sarah was not grasping at straws when his medical records made her consider this theory. But for the sake of ruling out other explanations of what his symptoms could indicate, I had to ask her if there was anything else that pushed her towards antifreeze. And sure enough, there was.
And I get a photo of the back of her vehicle, and the only thing that is in there is that jug of antifreeze. And I thought it was kind of strange because it was a newer vehicle, low mileage. I want to say like they got the vehicle with only 30,000 miles on it. So at that point, I just couldn't even understand why she would have antifreeze. Like she strikes me as someone more who would have her husband do those kinds of things for her. And then I was curious about her other vehicle that her husband said had been parked on their property. It was the vehicle that she drove from Maine to South Carolina. And then I asked him if he could send me photos of inside that vehicle because I was just curious. And sure enough, there was also a jug of antifreeze in that vehicle as well.
Now, Sarah wasn't alone in her belief that Brandon was poisoned. Part of Sarah's process in conducting her own investigation into what happened to her son involved gathering opinions from other professionals in the field. One of the people that Sarah reached out to was Dr. John Philpin, a retired forensic psychologist and independent criminal profiler. Dr. Philpin has had an impressive career, serving as a commentator on Court TV's Prime Time Justice. He appeared on Inside Edition, 2020, and America's Most Wanted. All of the work that Dr. Philpin does now in his retirement is pro bono, which I think implies that he is unbiased as he's not being paid by either side to form an opinion. Now, what I'm going to read is a long email that Dr. Philpin sent to Detective Suddeth on Asheboro Police Department. I want to note that he sent this to Detective Suddeth after he no longer had the case. So he didn't get a response from Detective Suddeth because it just wasn't his job anymore. But I'm sure that it got moved to the appropriate channels, and I'm sure that Detective Johnson, among others, heard about it. And like everything else, they dropped the ball. They never acknowledged his email, and they never sent a response. Here's what Dr. Philpin had to say, quote, Having reviewed what information is available, I believe that the manner of Mr. Embry's death was homicide, and the cause of death was the failure of bodily organs to continue functioning as a result of the ingestion of a toxic substance that had metabolized before death. I've seen no evidence of suicidal ideation or any ongoing mental disturbance. As examination of the symptom profile for antifreeze poisoning is instructive here. Nausea, vomiting, dizziness, fatigue, and headache, slurred speech, stupor, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, acidosis, organ failure, coma, and death. It is unfortunate that the separate toxicology test for this substance was not conducted. Also, a review of Mr. Embry's medical record would have revealed previous episodes. It has been noted that Mr. Embry had a medical record of prior visits to emergency medical services that present as quite similar to those described above. The question of a pattern of poisonings also should be examined. On one such occasion, he received dialysis and was revived. Recommended medical interventions for this type of poisoning include dialysis, intravenous fluids, and/or medications. It should be noted that cases of antifreeze poisoning have increased in recent years, and these cases have been widely publicized. And then he lists some examples. For roughly 2 to 3 days, he was in no physical condition to perform the destructive violence apparent in the apartment, and I suspect he was restrained. Parentheses, handcuffs. The few photographs I've seen suggest to me an apartment that has been trashed. Mr. Embry's clothing appears to have been removed from his body by someone else. The clothing is inside out, adjacent to his body. I'd like to discuss all of the above with you at your convenience. You were the initial lead detective on the case, and I think your impressions would be most valuable. Please advise and thank you in advance. Again, he sent this and received no response. He followed up and received no response. So, what does this all mean? Honestly, I have no fucking clue. But what I do know is this. Something happened to Brandon Embry, and nobody can definitively say what because Brandon was failed on multiple levels. Asheboro closed the case, and once Detective Johnson took over, she abandoned all of the leads that Detective Suddeth thought held the answers. We will never know of what came of Cassandra's phone records because, again, Detective Suddeth just got a warrant for them. And then not even a month later, Detective Johnson took over the case. This means that not a single person has been held accountable for what happened to Brandon, except for himself. Asheboro Police Department, Detective Johnson in particular, is still insistent on pushing their bull-fucking shit narrative that he hurt himself, that Brandon did this to himself. He beat himself up. He cut his own wrist almost to the bone. He gave himself 2 black eyes. He gave himself massive abrasions all over his body. When the meth theory didn't work out because his tox screen came back negative, Detective Johnson pushed for another narrative, synthetic marijuana. And when the medical examiner tested for that, and that came back negative, they dug their heels into the ground, threw their hands into the fucking air, and essentially said, fuck it. What upsets me the most about cases like this, especially when I develop a relationship with the victim's mother, it's that these mothers not only had to lose a child, but they also have to relive the trauma every fucking day. Sarah talks about Brandon's case every day of her life. She is constantly re-evaluating conversations with Cassandra, combing over evidence, looking at the photos of Brandon's apartment, photos of Brandon in the hospital. Every day that Brandon's case does not get the look that it deserved is another day where his mother has to live through her grief just to keep his story alive. And to me, that is fucking unacceptable. To put things into perspective, I want to play a snippet of audio between Sarah and the infamous Detective Johnson.
And it's very odd behavior. And how does she know that there was something about the toilet? The toilet was ripped up out of the ground. And even if you fall on a toilet, I mean, that takes, there was struggle. The drywall bashed in. I went in my own house and tried to throw myself against the wall. And you know what? The drywall doesn't give. There had to have been a struggle. Where that mirror was broken was the inside corner. You know, like that, there was blood that was washed off. There was blood that was washed off the mirror. There was blood that was washed off the wall. There was so much blood in that apartment. Then the coroner tells me that there wasn't very much blood at the scene.
To me, this audio demonstrates a frantic mother who is desperately trying to get a detective to do her job. And to hear her talk about how she's throwing herself into her drywall to try to replicate what happened to Brandon, I don't know. I had a mental image of her doing that, and it just really didn't sit well with me. And to think of a mother trying to recreate the scene where her son passed is just not okay and should never happen. During my last conversation with Sarah, she said something that really stuck out to me, and I want to read the quote directly. She said, quote, "Everything in my life has been set aside for the last 3 years just to try to figure out what happened to Brandon." I told Sarah that I wanted to include a call to action in this episode, so if you're listening, I ask that you help Sarah out. I've said this before, but consuming true crime content means that you need to be a responsible true crime consumer. We are listening to these stories, but we need to remember that these stories involve real people that have gone through this trauma and that are hurt. And the one thing we can do in return is to help. Sarah would like to ask you all to keep sharing this podcast, any podcast that covers Brandon's story. Keep sharing his story, share Brandon's case, sign the petitions, which I'll link in the show notes. Call Asheboro Police Department, ask them to look over his case. Email, call the DA. Send emails asking for accountability and an appropriate investigation. I asked Sarah to describe Brandon specifically for all of you listeners, and this is what she had to say.
You know, I think essence is one of the best ways to describe Brandon. There was just something about his presence. He was just well versed on so many topics, and he wasn't a super like judgmental kind of person. So he was just someone you could have these heart to heart talks with. You could confide in him. He was always someone you could turn to if you needed someone to listen. He was nice to have around. You wouldn't, just a very good presence. He had a good heart. He was the person that I always called on if I needed help, if I needed to do something. In fact, I had just had him come over and dog sit for me because I needed to go take care of something for his sister. And, it's really hard because now when I need to take care of things regarding Brandon's case, it's like hard for me because he would have been the person that I called to help me, and he's not here anymore.
I'm not religious, but I feel like if there is a heaven, I'd like to think Brandon is up there making mead, playing Xbox, and probably doing some powerlifting in between it all. Rest in peace, Brandon. If you liked what you heard today, please like, review, subscribe, share the story. It's really important to me, guys. I've gotten to know Sarah, and she's a really special person. So her social medias are linked in the show notes. Give her pages a follow. She goes into way more detail about her son's case. You can find me on literally every platform: TikTok, Facebook, Twitter at @FThatPod. Instagram is @FThat_pod.